next presenter is Cole Snedeker. He's going to, there's the title of his, you heard from the top-down weapons that Harry gave. Now you're going to get it from the bottom up. Now, Cole is a senior at the High-Tech High School in Lincroft, and he is also a volunteer here at Camp Evans, InfoAge, and his area of expertise is the World War I diorama room and the World War II diorama room. If you haven't seen that, you look at section J, no, I forget what section it is, and K on your map. Now normally you call people guides, okay, but we don't have guides here. And it's a tribute to Cole and his expertise that he's called a docent. The level of expertise you need to be a docent is significantly higher than being a guide. And Cole, we're very happy to have him as a docent. He's a senior at the High-Tech High School. He plans to go to college and major in history at some Ivy League college. His preference would be Yale University. So please welcome Cole Snedeker.
So, hello everyone. So, as Harry talked about in his presentation, he mentioned some of the weapons, like the terror weapons and the tanks and planes and everything that the major powers developed during the Great War. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about those. So, let's get started. I'm going to talk about a lot of specific examples as well. But the first weapon we're going to talk about is we're going to start out basic, very basic, the bolt-action rifle. Now this is what almost every foot soldier in the Great War used. It wasn't some sort of automatic weapon, it was just a bolt-action rifle. So I'm actually going to skip ahead a bit. I'm going to start with this one. Now the bolt-action rifle, the concept of this thing is, it's basically just, it's a rifle and it has generally 5 rounds in its magazine. So basically, if you see up here, there's a thing called a bolt. And when you pull the trigger to shoot the bullet out of the gun, after that's done, you can pull the bolt up and back, and that will cycle out the cartridge in the gun, and then you can put it back down into its starting position, the starting position would be down to the side of the rifle, like down here. And that will cycle out the cartridge and put another bullet in. So these bolt-action rifles could hold 5 rounds. As I said, most of them could, which was a significant step up from the previous European war, which was the Franco-Prussian War 40 years earlier. Or I guess you could say another analog closer to home would be the American Civil War around the same time, just a few years earlier, where the soldiers would all have, they all had rifles or muskets, but only 1 bullet in them. And once you shoot that 1 bullet, you have to reload. Now these things, since you have 5, you can shoot 1 bullet, and then within say a second or two, if you cycle it quickly, you can shoot another bullet, and then another, and then another. So even though we often think of machine guns as one of the biggest advances in firepower for infantry with World War I, it was actually also sort of the bolt-action rifle. Now these are going back here. These are some British soldiers with their rifles in a trench. This is actually the SMLE, the Lee Enfield, one of the most famous rifles of the Great War. And here is a more detailed picture of the SMLE. But this one was significant actually because it held 10 rounds as opposed to the normal 5. So British soldiers had a very effective weapon. And one thing I also wanted to talk about here is why did they choose the bolt style for rifles as opposed to some other way of cycling bullets? Well, if you think back to like the Wild West, where if you ever see like a Hollywood movie or something where they're shooting these guns and they're shooting the bullets pretty quickly, that's because they used a mechanism called repeating, where basically the entire trigger of this gun is like a lever, and you pull back, once you shot the bullet, you pull back the lever and it ejects the bullet and puts the next one into the magazine or into the chamber automatically. That wasn't used in World War I for bolt-action rifles, mainly because of what we see here. in the trenches, if you're putting a rifle over the trench, you can't really pull a lever back and down under the gun to reload the next bullet. You'd have to like take the rifle off. So that's why they chose the bolt design. And there were some repeating rifles used in World War I, notably by the cavalry. And this particular one is actually the Winchester repeater, which Winchester also made a number of the famous repeating rifles from the Wild West. But they also manufactured this one, which was used by some cavalry during the war. And down here, this is just how bullets would be loaded into a bolt-action rifle. They usually use a thing called a stripper clip, which allows you to load 5 bullets into the gun at once. And then this metal, they're all attached to this metal thing, and the metal thing would fall off to the side after you push them in. And now, I want to go back to this one because starting out from the progression, this is the French Lebel rifle. This is probably the oldest standard issue bolt action that was used during the war. And it was interesting because it doesn't have, like if you look at this one has a magazine protruding below. This one used a tubular magazine, which means that the bullets were like laid in a line out this way. And this was a much older design. This is from 1886 actually. And this rifle, it was regarded as generally okay. There were some problems where sometimes when you tried to shoot it, like something would explode, which was not good at all. But this is what they had to deal with mostly. And they did develop they were developing more rifles at the time, the French army, but they just didn't have enough of them to replace the Lebels. And the tubular magazine was also something that was kind of used a lot in the repeating rifles as well. See, this isn't actually the magazine, this is part of the trigger. The bullets in a repeater were arranged this way. So goes back to the older thinking of back in the 1800s. And now, as I said, here's the British SMLE. This is the German Gewehr 98. This was their standard issue rifle. It was also a very good gun, very reliable. It did have the standard 5 rounds in the magazine, like most bolt actions this time had, but it was also very accurate. I'll just give a few more examples, just briefly to touch on some of the other things. This is the Austrian Empire or Austro-Hungarian Empire's bolt action of choice. This is the Gewehr M95, and it's significant because it actually has. If you look at all these other rifles, these rifles are in the position where the bolt is tilted up. This is where you would be midway through cycling through a cartridge, or where you'd be reloading. And this one too. This one is in the same exact position. It's where you'd be reloading, but the bolt is to the side. That's because this one used something called a straight pull bolt, where the soldier wouldn't actually have to move the bolt up to reload. They could just pull it straight back and put another cartridge in when they were ready to reload. This made it much quicker and easier to reload and just more convenient. So that was an interesting development that they had. This is actually the American rifle of choice, the M1903 Springfield. This is what most American troops used. It was also a very, very good rifle. It was very accurate, pretty reliable. It was one of the higher ups, probably almost up there with the SMLE and Gewehr 98. But actually, I shouldn't say most American troops, because it is actually a bit of a misconception. The Americans also had this second one called the M1917 Enfield, and it was actually deployed to more American troops than the Springfield was. But most people don't know that because the Springfield gets all the fame. Why that's the case, I'm not really sure, but it might be because this one was around for a lot longer. This one came in right at the end of the war, as the Americans were coming into France. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about is the machine gun, one of the most iconic weapons of World War I. So the machine guns, they are kind of a development, actually going all the way back to medieval times, or I should say Renaissance, a little later, in like the 1500s or so. They started making these weapons where they would basically have a bunch of barrels, like in a grid or in a row, on like a platform elevated this way. So all the barrels were facing this way, and basically they'd shoot every barrel off in a row And they experimented with that a little bit in medieval times, but in the Franco-Prussian War, they did more with that. And then also the other thing is the Gatling gun, which was developed in the American Civil War, where you'd have a rotating set of barrels, and every time the circle of barrels rotates around, one is at the top, another bullet is automatically put in, and when they're at the bottom, it gets shot out. And that was developed into the modern machine gun by taking those 6 barrels, or that grid of barrels on the volley guns, and putting it into just one. So now you could have, this was developed by a guy named Hiram Maxim. He developed a way that you could just shoot out them all at once, or in consecutive order from one barrel. And the Maxim gun, it was marketed to all the great colonial powers. This was around the 1880s, and they used it in their colonial African wars. But at the time, as World War I came around at the start in 1914, at the start of the war, every major power had basically copied his design and made their own machine guns. So this is the German MG08. This is literally basically just a slightly improved Maxim gun. Here's another MG08 over here, and on the left, this is the British Vickers gun, which is basically just their equivalent. Again, it looks very similar to, they look very similar to each other. They're basically all the same design based off of the Maxim gun. And one thing you might notice is up here, this big barrel, it looks much bigger than what a bullet should be, because the bullet is just coming out of here. So does anyone want to take a guess as to what that's for, why it's so big?
Cooling?
Water cooling? Yep, water cooling. So when you're shooting all these bullets out, one in a row consecutively for a long period of time, it's going to get pretty hot. The metal's going to get hot, and that's not good for the gun. It could even start damaging things or melting if it takes or if you're firing it off for too long. So they designed this thing where they just put a bunch of water around in a big sleeve around the barrel to keep it cool. And this did make these guns very, very heavy. So these weren't really mobile at all. You had to stick these on a tripod, or even some sort of larger apparatus like this. So they were pretty static. Now, as we're moving through the war though, one of the big things about warfare, and especially with World War I, is that every country is constantly trying to develop new technology to try to outwit the other side, or to improve on their own technology to outwit the other side, get better weapons. And once the next step they took with this, one thing they did is they managed to find another way to cool the weapon. Now instead of using water, they decided to developed a weapon where this is actually, it's going to sound weird because this is another example of a very large barrel, but this is actually not for water cooling. They developed a way where you could put a bunch of metal around the barrel, and they connected the metal to the barrel with in such a way that it would basically absorb all of the heat that was coming off of the bullets coming out of the gun, out of the barrel. And it's called air cooling. So there's this big sleeve with air in the middle. And this allowed the guns to be much lighter, much more portable. So now soldiers could take one of these, our soldier could take one of these out and move around much more. He could advance, if say that there was a charge or something over the trenches through no man's land, he could advance with his soldiers or his squad mates and support them. And this particular example it's called the Lewis gun. It's the British were the first ones to really do this. And here's another picture of a Lewis gun. This guy's holding it. It doesn't have to be on a tripod or anything. Although they could stick a bipod on the bottom, which would allow it to be more stable if you're firing on the ground or over a trench. But again, this is air cooling. It's just a big metal sleeve which absorbs the heat, along with there's a little air pocket inside there. Now, the other countries started doing the same thing. The French actually developed one known as the Chauchat. This was actually considered to be I think it came around the same time as the Lewis gun, but it was considered by many to be the first modern machine gun, or light machine gun, I should say. But it was an interesting design, but a lot of people say it wasn't very successful. History is not too kind on this weapon. The main thing is because it has this magazine on the bottom, And this thing, it's kind of hard to see in this picture because of the lighting, but the bullets in here, they're completely open to the elements. This is like a completely open thing. There's no like metal there. And the reason for that was so that the soldier could see how many bullets were left in his gun before he had to reload. But the problem was once you put that in the trench, where there's all sorts of mud and stuff, that's gonna get inside that magazine and just screw everything up. And another thing was, part of the bad reputation with this gun was because it was sent to the American Expeditionary Force, but the Americans wanted to rechamber it. We wanted to rechamber it in our own bullets, our own rounds, which were of a different caliber. And when you try to rechamber a gun pretty quickly, because they wanted to do this quick enough so that they could get it out to all the American troops. When you try to do that quickly, it's a complicated process, and it didn't go very well. There were all sorts of problems with the rechambering, where like the dimensions were wrong, or just the materials they used for that weren't very good. But this is the American version of the show shot. As you can see, it does have a different type of magazine. But yeah, this was again a French machine gun, one of the probably the first true modern light machine gun, along with the Lewis gun, which I showed earlier. And then towards the end of the war, we're getting to see even lighter and more compact designs. Like this is the American BAR. This is a very famous weapon for, especially in the 1920s when you have Prohibition and there's all the gangsters and stuff. This was, along with the Thompson submachine gun, this is a very iconic weapon of that era. But it was originally developed at the end of World War I. And it has about a 20-round magazine, and it does have a big bipod, but you could fire it from any other position standing. And it's actually interesting because this was actually intended to be fired from the hip. So if you had your gun like this, it was actually called walking fire, where the strategy that they built this gun around was that as a soldier was advancing, he would have his gun out like this and just be firing like this as he was moving forward, which, oh.
What was the caliber of the bar?
30 caliber, I believe. 30 caliber.
It was no different from the M1 that was ultimately developed also?
The M1 Garand? Yep,
Yeah,
same
except that it
caliber.
had more bullets to fire, right?
Mm-hmm. I believe that is the case. They did use, yeah, I should say there were a number of different calibers they used. Like the heavy machine guns use often 50 caliber rounds, whereas the lighter ones, and a lot of the bolt action rifles generally used around 30 caliber. And then say a pistol would be oftentimes around like maybe 15 or 20 caliber. I guess oftentimes you would express it in terms of millimeters. Like the Germans used a pistol known as the P08 Luger, which used 9mm rounds. But yeah, so that is the BAR. People often incorrectly say bar, but it's actually pronounced with each letter separately. Now, the next thing we have is we've gotten even smaller now. This is at the very end of the war, so they're constantly progressing to smaller and smaller. Now we have the first submachine guns. These are actually first developed in two different locations, kind of like with the light machine guns. The Germans developed this one on top. This is the MP-18, and the Italians developed this one at the bottom. This is the Beretta M1918. They're both, as I said, both developed around the same time. We don't actually know which one was first used, but this one was used a lot more. This one didn't see as much service. But this one was developed right at the end, as I said. I'm going to start getting into more about trench warfare and attacking trenches. So as I'm segueing into that, we're going to talk about these, because as Harry mentioned earlier, towards the end of the war, when the Germans launched the big spring offensive, that kind of finally broke the stalemate that had been trench warfare through the last 4 years prior. So finally now there was sort of a mobile war going on. And because of that, they needed a lot of weapons that would be useful for assaulting trenches at close range and look like just fighting in close quarters. And this is kind of also where the submachine gun came from. It does use lower caliber rounds. Often this one actually used, I believe, the same pistol. It used pistol caliber rounds, 9mm, and it could fire. It had about a 32 round magazine, but it could fire a lot of bullets. And as I said, these obviously aren't to scale, but if you can see that this is a lot smaller than say this thing. And yeah, these were actually pioneered by German stormtroopers during Operation Michael and the succeeding battles, where they would take these into the trenches and use them at close range. And it's a lot easier to use one of these things than like a big rifle. Also, it's not just the amount of bullets that it puts out, but just the size of it. Like it's hard to maneuver a long rifle in a trench. But now that was basically the big progression of infantry, small arms. But I'm going to talk about a few other interesting weapons that weren't mentioned in that. Firstly, we have this was something that came out of Russia. This is the Fedorov Automat. It actually looks a lot like, I don't know if anyone thinks it looks a lot like the AK-47 that you might see, or some sort of modern assault rifle. And a lot of people do say that this might be the true predecessor to the assault rifle. It used higher caliber rounds than say the MP-18, the submachine guns, but it also had automatic firing capabilities. It was really called a select fire gun because it could fire you could choose to fire one bullet at a time or multiple bullets at a time, automatic. So that was a very, very interesting design. We also had the development of some self-loading rifles, or I should say semi-automatic, which means it's kind of like this, except it doesn't have the automatic capability. You can only fire one at a time. It's also different from a bolt action because you don't need to pull back the bolt each time. You can just fire one, like in very rapid succession. And the French really developed the one self-loading rifle or semi-automatic that was used in mass quantities. That was the RSC 1917. And the British also experimented with it. They actually converted, this is another Lee Enfield, their bolt action rifle. They converted it to a semi-automatic mechanism, which that's what all this big apparatus here is for. It actually protruded off to the side as well. It's hard to see in this profile shot, but that's how it was. Now, another interesting thing that the U.S. developed was it's kind of hard to see, but this is another Springfield, a 1903 Springfield bolt action, and they actually stuck this big magazine up. It's actually up to the diagonal, but this thing was called the Pedersen device, and it was basically just a conversion for it to shoot lower caliber rounds, but you could shoot it semi-automatically, so it would be good for assaulting trenches at the very end of the war. And yeah, so there were a lot of one thing they did was, instead of developing new technology, which takes more time, they would often try to improve on their existing technology, which is what they did here. Now, as I said, I'm getting more and more into the close quarters of trenches because at the end of the war, when they were assaulting trenches, it got really nasty, and you needed different weapons than just a bolt action rifle for that kind of fighting. So one thing that's interesting is shotguns. Now, the U.S. was actually the only country to use shotguns on a very large scale during World War I, and this is a Winchester model 1897, which it was often called the trench gun or the trench sweeper because it was very effective at clearing trenches. And they actually had, it's interesting, they put a bayonet on it too. So even though it's a shotgun, you have a bayonet on the front. But this was used by the Americans, and very interestingly, the Germans actually protested against the use of this thing to The Hague because they thought it was immoral to use in war, which, I mean, isn't that kind of hard to argue when you have poison gas, bombing, shelling, and all that? But they did argue to The Hague, and the protest didn't go anywhere, but that's just an interesting thing that happened. Now, here are some pistols. They would often take into the trenches pistols too. Instead of using their bolt actions, a soldier would whip out a pistol as he's assaulting because you can shoot more bullets. Even though a bolt action rifle's round would be much more powerful, it's really more important to get more bullets on target at close range. So this is actually what I mentioned earlier, the 9mm German pistols. We have the P08 Luger, which is very famous from actually both World Wars. And this was a slightly earlier design. This is the Mauser C96, which is often considered one of the world's first semi-automatic pistols. But it was often called the broom handle, actually, because it looks very strange. because most pistols have their magazine behind the trigger. This one had it forward, and I guess people thought it kind of looked like a broom handle, but it also had a stock that could be put on the end, which kind of resembles a broom handle. And then this is the M1911, which was a very famous. It still is a very famous American pistol, very reliable, and the U.S. military still continued to use this thing in certain areas until I believe very recently. But so those are some very famous pistols. But actually, when you're assaulting a trench, or when you were assaulting a trench in World War I, oftentimes your firearm, your pistol, your submachine gun, even mostly bolt-action riflemen wouldn't even actually use their firearm as their primary weapon in a trench. They would actually use grenades. So you'd often see, like at the end of the war, German stormtroopers attacking a trench, going in with like 2 sacks on the sides of like 4 grenades each, and just they'd enter the trench and just start throwing grenade, reach down to their sack, grab another, throw it, reach down, grab another, throw it. And these were really their primary weapons oftentimes. Now the British developed this one. This is the Mills bomb. It was probably the most famous Allied grenade of the war. The U.S. also used it, and it kind of looks like a pineapple, which is given its nickname, because you see it has like these grooves on the sides. The reason they had those grooves was when it explodes, each of those like sections would break off into a different piece of shrapnel. And the Germans used a little bit different design. This is the they called it the potato masher grenade, or in German it's the Steilheimgranat. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. But yeah, they call it the potato masher because it kind of looks like a potato masher. But the way it works is you like throw it from this stick thing, and the advantage of that is you can throw it much further than you could something like this, because it's kind of like a lever concept. But theirs was more just a explosive type thing. Like it wasn't as much shrapnel design as this one. This one's kind of just a big explosion, and they're hoping that would do damage. But they're both good grenades. They both did their purpose. Now we also as we're getting into this, soldiers would use once they've expended their grenades, they'd often pull out their knife. Now if you look up here, this is another Lee Enfield with a bayonet, a bolt-action rifle with a bayonet on the end of it. If you look at that thing, that's a very long bayonet. That was the reason they made those so long, is because they were still thinking in the past, from the Franco-Prussian War, the American Civil War, even all the way back into Napoleonic times, nearly 100 years before, when they were thinking at the start of the war, okay, you'd have a bunch of troops out on a field in the open, firing each other in neat lines and just standing there. That's actually what they did for the first few battles of the war, and it didn't go well. But they were thinking, once you've expended all your rounds, or once a bayonet charge was ordered, then you'd be charging into another line of troops with their own bayonets. And the idea was that a very long bayonet would allow you to try to strike the enemy at close range before he could hit you, because you have much longer reach. The problem was, once you got into trenches in World War I, assaulting a trench, the thing is so long that it's too hard to maneuver inside a confined space of a trench. So soldiers would often just ditch they wouldn't even use their bayonets. They would just use their own knives. And as the war progressed, they also started making the Allied commanders and stuff realized this, and they started making bayonets shorter and shorter because it was more useful in trenches. But one thing they developed this is a British development. It's called a handlebar knife, and it's a knife that it can act as a bayonet, but you can very easily just take it off and use it as a field knife. So you don't have to unlatch it or anything. It just pulls off very easily. But knives. The thing was, knives weren't always standard issue. Like the British didn't actually issue knives to every single soldier. The Germans did. They issued knives to everyone, but the British didn't. So soldiers would often resort to making their own weapons, melee weapons, for assaulting an enemy trench. Such as up here we have two examples. The first one here this is actually or actually I'll start with this one. This is a French nail knife. It's literally just a piece of. So if you went out into the field in no man's land, or just at the edge of no man's land up next to your trench, you have all this barbed wire. The barbed wire has metal supports that are holding it up. So they would just take a piece of one of these metal supports, take a piece of it, and take it to their local blacksmith. And because like there were blacksmiths everywhere in this time, it was very important. Blacksmiths were actually very important to doing all sorts of machine tasks in the trenches, repairing weapons, etc., etc. But they would take it to their blacksmith, and he would melt it into this shape and flatten out this end. And now you have a very effective knife that you can use. So that was one thing. Another one was, this is actually an American knife. This is called a knuckle knife because you put your fingers in these holes, and you can actually use this. This has two uses. One is that you can obviously stab and strike with this, but in a close range trench fight, you might also need to punch, and this is what these spikes on the end of the knuckles were for. So yeah, it could get really nasty in a close range fight where both of you are trying to kill the other guy. And really, in one of these hand-to-hand engagements, these things wouldn't last long. It's not like even when you're seeing like Hollywood sword fights where they last so long, in reality sword fights didn't last long at all. They usually lasted maybe 2 or 3 strikes at most. If like it would be lucky if one of the guys could even parry at all. And the same principle would apply to hand-to-hand fighting in World War I. So it's best to have as many uses at your disposal as you could. Now, they also developed the other things too, like soldiers would take clubs. They would make their own clubs. They would literally just take a piece of wood and just stick a bunch of nails in it, like this example, or wrap a bunch of barbed wire around it, like in this example. And now you have a very effective club that you can use. Also, even shovels, people would often take, especially the British, because the British again didn't have a knife. So they might resort. The British didn't have a knife, but they did have shovels. Every British soldier had a shovel that was used as an entrenching tool. So they would resort to their shovels, and these were actually highly effective weapons in the trenches, believe it or not. They often sharpened the edges of the shovel to make it for the explicit purpose of being able to be used as a weapon as well. But yeah, it was very interesting how they would take anything that they had at their disposal to use for war. Now, the Germans actually, and the Central Powers countries, they didn't always have shovels that were, the British had the British had shovels that were made into 2 parts. So oftentimes, instead of just taking a full shovel, the British might just take the handle of the shovel and put like a cog around it. The French did this too. And so now you have they called them cog-head clubs or cog-wheel clubs that they could use. Whereas the Germans and Austrians, if they ever went to use a shovel, their shovels were all one piece, so they would just do that. This particular example is an Austrian shovel. Now, I'll talk a little bit about cavalry as well. I did mention that the cavalry had some repeating rifles. They also did use some bolt-action rifles with much shorter barrels, because kind of like when you're in a trench, when you're a cavalry officer or a soldier on a horse, it's probably better if you have a shorter weapon that's easier to maneuver, just because you're moving around so much. And like if you're dismounting or something, it's more convenient to have something short. But yeah, this is an example of a cavalry rifle. Up here is they still actually use swords with cavalry, which is interesting. This is actually a Patton saber. It's an American one, developed by George S. Patton. This was actually one of the very last, I believe it was actually the last cavalry sword ever developed in history for service use rather than ceremonial use, which is interesting. But yeah, cavalry, at the start of the war, cavalry did see some effective use in their traditional role. All the countries still had a lot of cavalry around because it was kind of like a very I'll say it again, traditionalist, or kind of just a thing that the aristocracy was built, or it was very tied to that sense of honor and being on a horse mounted. But as they charged into machine guns and soldiers with accurate rifles, they just got annihilated. So they often dismounted and went into the trenches with these carbines or rifles after the first stages of the war, because they couldn't go out in the open like that. And the swords didn't really see much use because of that. Now here's a picture of a cavalry soldier. This guy actually has a lance. It's literally like a medieval lance that he's brought out, or like a lance from like the 1800s or something, Napoleonic lance. And this was on the Eastern Front. On the Eastern Front, cavalry did see a little more use in the traditional sense because it was a more open warfare, and there were less. I don't want to say there were like almost no machine guns, because there were, but there were less machine guns. So they did see a little more use, but still, after the first few months, they were kind of shoved to the side mostly. But now I'll talk a bit about, I'll start getting into vehicles. We started out with, before I get into tanks, we started out with the predecessor of the armored car. The armored cars, they were developed around the very start of the war. Around 1914, countries were first getting out their first armored cars. But it's basically just a truck with a bunch of armor and a machine gun on it. The problem with these was that once you got into trench warfare, they couldn't go off-road into the mud or anything, so they didn't see that much use. So the next thing they came up with was of course the tank. Now this is literally just a tractor with an armored box on top. This was the very first tank. It's known as Little Willie, and this thing was pretty revolutionary because it could cross mud, it could cross craters, it could cross trenches, it could go off-road, and it looks very psychologically, I'll go to the next example, this looks very psychologically imposing if you see this charging at you. And this was the first, although Little Willie was the first prototype, this is the British Mark I tank. They actually called it a land ship, but because it kind of looks like a big battleship to the people who were designing it, because they'd never seen one of these, or they never had the concept of one of these things before, so it literally looks like a big battleship or something coming out on land. But it had two guns on the sides. The British actually made male and female versions of these tanks. The male versions had cannons, and the female versions had machine guns instead of cannons. But yeah, this is the British Mark I tank, the first true tank that saw lots of service. It was they designed it very long with this kind of lozenge shape so that it could cross trenches easily, because a trench was a bit too wide for something like this to cross normal trenches. And actually, as tanks came out, as they were getting later and later into the war, the enemy started making their trenches wider and wider as they could. They couldn't really do a whole lot of that because it just takes too many resources, but wherever possible, they would try to widen their trenches to prevent tanks from crossing them. But here's another British Mark tank. This one's a female version. This one's actually a Mark V. So they progressed from Mark I through to Mark V. The British, they kept improving and improving on their design. And this is the primary design that they had at the very end of the war, the British Mark V land ship. Now they also made some tanks with just machine guns on them as support. This is a Whippet tank, British tank. It has like 2 to 3 machine guns sticking out of this big thing protruding up on top. So not all tanks, they didn't put guns on all tanks, because really they didn't really need to, because they weren't facing any enemy tanks yet. The Allies were basically unopposed at this point. The Germans hadn't developed any tanks yet. Now the French also developed their own line of tanks. They started with these things, which are sort of reminiscent of Little Willie. This is a Schneider CA, but these things, the problem with this is it was hard for it to cross trenches and get over like craters and stuff because its tracks were so short. And it also has a little gun right there, but it's only on one side, so it can't really fire. It doesn't have a very good firing angle. But the next development was this. This is the Saint-Chamond. They lengthened it so it was longer, and they made the tracks longer, but even still, this one had problems with crossing trenches, and it has one gun at the front sticking out. But the most significant tank that the French developed, and probably the most, aside from the original British tanks, the most significant one of the entire Great War was this one. This is the French Renault FT-17. it actually only had 2 crew members, whereas something like a land ship would have maybe 8 or so, 8 or 10. This one was much smaller, and it only had 2 crew members. But what's so revolutionary about it is that it has this rotating turret. So this gun up here and this big thing can turn 360 degrees. That's what you see on all modern tanks, basically. They all have turrets that can turn all around. And so that's why this was such a significant thing, because now you can fire in any direction. You don't need to turn the entire tank, you can just turn the turret. And some of them had machine guns instead of cannons, but the principle was the same. This was deployed in large numbers by the French, and the Americans also developed their own version, the M1917. Our version of that, it didn't actually get to see any service in the war because it ended before they could ship them out to Europe, but we still kept them for a while afterwards, and there are still some around in museums across the US, and they look pretty much the same. The turret looks slightly different, but now we're going to get to talk about Germany's response. This was their one big tank that they fielded. In fact, it was really their only tank. It's called the A7V. They called it, or people refer to it often as like the armored tortoise or armored box, because it literally looks like a big tortoise or box thing. This thing was massive. It had a crew of 20 people to operate it. Yeah. So it had 1 gun on the front, and it had 2 machine guns on each side. So one around. It's very hard to see, but there's one right there, and then another one right there, and then in the back there were 2 more sticking out in tandem. But yeah, this thing was monstrous, and I'm going along with Bob's trivia, or John's trivia question. How many tanks do you think? How many of these tanks do you think the Germans built? So keep thinking about that as I'm going through this presentation. How many did they build? Because I won't disclose that. But they also these tanks did see, there was actually 1 tank versus tank battle during the Great War, only 1. It was towards the end, the three of these tanks met 3 British Mark V tanks, two females and 1 male. So 2 of them with machine guns and 1 with a gun. And I believe the Germans were driven back from that battle, but that was the first tank versus tank battle in history, and as far as I know, the only one from World War I. But one last tank that I want to mention before I move on is this massive thing. This is probably the biggest tank ever built. Not necessarily the heaviest, but the largest in size. This is the French Char 2C. They developed this at the end of the war as so the French at the end of the war, they were envisioning, after 1918, they were envisioning some more massive offensives into Germany in 1919, which this was developed for. It was developed to support these massive things, to destroy bunkers and cross trenches and support the infantry. Of course, those offensives never happened because the Germans surrendered at the end of 1918 with the armistice. But if that had happened, we would have seen these things deployed. It had 2 machine guns, 1 on each side of the front. There was another one on the other side. A large 75mm cannon on top, and another machine gun on the back. Or sometimes they also had a version with an autocannon on the back instead. So this thing was massive, and they actually did use these. The French kept these for propaganda purposes throughout the 1930s and into the 40s, when they were lost during the Battle of France when the Nazis invaded in World War II. But that's a truly massive vehicle. Now, what about anti-tank weapons? So during World War I, as they were at the very start, when tanks first appeared, the German soldiers that were facing these British land ships had no idea what to do. They tried shooting them with their rifles, and machine guns, but that didn't do anything because they were bulletproof. So the main counter to the very first tanks was to just use like field guns or artillery pieces, because even though a tank is armored, if it gets hit by an artillery shell, it's not going to go well for the tank. It'll probably just blow it up. But into 1917 and 1918, they started developing like legitimate counters to tanks. They had one thing they did was the Germans took one of their potato masher grenades and stuck a bunch more grenade shell cases at the bottom or bodies. So now you have this one massive grenade which you could throw at a tank and it would blow up and hopefully pierce the armor and destroy it. Which these were, as far as I know, these were successful in their task. They called these Granata. It's like I don't know how to pronounce it in German really. I'm sorry, but it was. I'm not even gonna bother with the pronunciation actually. Just know that they're anti-tank grenades. It's like I'm not even gonna bother. But they also had the Tankgewehr. I believe that's how you pronounce it. This was the first true anti-tank rifle. It was basically just a bolt-action rifle with larger rounds that would try to. The idea for this was to pierce the armor of a tank, and these were successful as well, but to varying degrees. The bullets didn't always go through the armor. So we had the Tankgewehr and the. It's like Geballte Ladung, I believe that's how you pronounce it. But these were the two main counters that the Germans had, and the Allies developed similar things. Now we're going to start talking about artillery. As I said, artillery was one of the main counters to the very first tanks. This particular artillery piece is a field gun. So I should go over the types of artillery that they used in the Great War. There are differences. They had field guns, howitzers, and mortars. So a field gun is basically a direct fire weapon. It's not firing over, say, trees or buildings. It's just firing straight ahead. That's what this is. A howitzer is a gun that fires. I'll actually go to the next slide just to show you. A howitzer is something like this that fires up more at a diagonal, so indirectly over trees and buildings, etc. And then a mortar is something that fires like almost completely straight up at nearly a 90-degree angle. Not exactly, because then it's just going to come down on top of you. But they would fire it up such that the projectile would come down at almost a 90-degree angle on target. And there is some gray area between howitzers and mortars, but those are the basic principles. But artillery tactics in the Great War, they're really a continuation of what was going on in the previous few conflicts. Notably, at the end of the 19th century in South Africa, the British were fighting the Boers, which were Dutch settlers in Africa. But that's where they really first pioneered the use of indirect fire artillery. And in the Great War, they really expanded upon that. They started using planes, ground spotting, even radio communications to coordinate with all their troops, to coordinate spotting so that their artillery could become more and more accurate. And they started using new tactics like the creeping barrage or the rolling barrage, like Harry mentioned earlier, which was soldiers, if they're advancing across no man's land on an offensive, the friendly artillery they would make it so that it would fire directly ahead of the advancing troops, but not so much that the troops would get hit by their own fire. But the principle with that is that the enemies are taking cover in their trenches, so they can't fire on the incoming friendly troops. So that was a new tactic they used. But so field guns. This is a French 75mm field gun. They just call it the French 75. In official terms, it would be the M1897. But anyways, this was really the first true modern artillery piece. Often people say, or the first true field gun, because the main reason of why that is, firstly, is because it incorporates advanced shells. They had been developing more and more shells since the prior conflicts. By this point, by the way, they had completely gotten past cannonballs that you see in the Civil War. All the projectiles they use now were shells, which basically means that they have like a curved front on them, like a kind of a triangular pyramidal front cone front which improves their aerodynamic capabilities. But anyways, the main reason why this was so significant, the French 75, was because of its rate of fire. The way they designed this was that it used a cradle such that when the gun when an artillery gun at this time would fire, there would be so much recoil that the whole gun would shift back a little bit, and then the soldiers would need to push the gun back into its original position afterwards, so that it was the shells would be on target for the next firing. This one had a cradle such that it absorbed the recoil, so now they didn't have to reposition the gun every single time. So this thing could fire. It could fire, I believe, I read a statistic somewhere that it could fire 6.4 rounds in 10 seconds, which that's like one round almost every 2 seconds, which that is, I'm assuming that would be with an extremely well-trained crew, but and that is a lot of experience and under ideal conditions. But really every few seconds they could fire a round out of one of these things. And now here's some more howitzers. This is a German Big Bertha siege howitzer. They really brought around, this was a new development, but they really also brought around a lot of older siege guns to use in shelling the enemy trenches, because they just needed more. They needed as many guns as they could get, because that was really the norm for the 4 years of trench warfare, was just shelling each other every single day for 4 years. So they needed as many guns and as many shells as they could. So they brought a lot of older ones into commission. But yeah, these things. This had a 480 millimeter caliber, which is just very big. And they also had very long range guns. Like this is another picture of the Paris gun, which Harry covered that earlier. But a lot of countries developed railroad guns like this. The idea is that if you have a railroad, you're such a big gun on a railroad, it's much easier to move that around. I mean, you can't really move a gun of this size on a truck or pull it with trucks or anything. It's just way too heavy. Although their mobility was restricted because of that. They would in order to deploy this or to even turn it to face enemy positions, they would have to either build another railroad track, like curved, or they would have to move it to a position where there was like a turn in the railroad track so it could fire at a different angle. But so artillery was extremely significant in the Great War. It's actually interesting because when you think about it, if you have bolt-action rifles, machine guns, tanks, poison gas, all of these things, the number one killer of troops in the Great War was actually artillery. I believe around 75% of all casualties during World War I were the result of artillery. So these things soldiers really feared artillery. Now here's a mortar. This is not the traditional, as I was saying, those field gun howitzer mortar. This is not a siege mortar, more so it's just a more infantry mortar. But this is a British Stokes mortar, which was one of the ones they used. Each side developed little mortars to shell each other in the trenches. But they also had, this was the Great War saw the first development of anti-aircraft guns, because of course it saw the first mass use of planes. So now in counter they developed anti-aircraft guns. And this is a QF-1 pom-pom. The British called them pom-poms because of the sound they made when they were firing. These things were sort of automatic, where they could fire shell after shell after shell in a row. So they called them pom-poms. And they would basically burst. They would shoot a shell out, and it would burst high up in the air at a specific altitude, and all the shrapnel the idea was that all the shrapnel would hit enemy planes. The idea wasn't to actually hit the plane itself, but that the shrapnel would damage it as it was flying all over the sky in all directions after the explosion. And in addition to that, we had the first mobile artillery, which they basically just took a howitzer and stuck it on a tank chassis. So this was an extension of the development of tanks. So as you can see, there was a lot of weapons were developed to counter existing weapons that were coming out, and multiple types of weapons were combined to develop the best possible technology to use to outwit the enemy. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about today is poison gas, one of the most iconic weapons of World War I. Now, poison gas, it was first deployed actually by the French most people think it was by the Germans, but it was actually first deployed by the French at the Battle of Loos in 1915. And they actually used, the thing was, they used tear gas. And tear gas, it's not deadly or harmful to humans at all. It's just an irritant. And so when the French started using they used tear gas at that battle to cover their assault on the German trenches. And funnily enough, the Germans didn't actually even notice that the French were using it because it was just an irritant. But and it kind of looks just like a smoke grenade or something, or like smoke coming from shells exploding around. So, but the Germans were the first to use gas for the explicit intent of harm as a weapon. In 1915, at the Second Battle of Ypres, they deployed a bunch of poison gas along they fired it from their cannons into the Allied lines. They used chlorine gas. That was their weapon of choice. And as the French they attacked the French soldiers, as the French soldiers were in their trenches, they started seeing this giant cloud of gas coming towards them, and they thought that the gas was a smoke screen to cover a German advance. So all the French soldiers, they called up literally every soldier up to the trench to get ready for a German assault. And then all of a sudden, all the soldiers started dropping coughing on the ground and writhing around, and they all fled in terror. And that was the first use of poison gas. Really, the Germans actually weren't able to follow up their success in repelling the French defenders of the trenches because they didn't know how to deal with it. They didn't realize that the gas would be as deadly as it was. So when the Germans started coming forward, they started dropping down on the ground and coughing, etc., getting sick from their own gas. And that was really one of the big themes of gas throughout the rest of the war, was that there were multiple instances where one side would deploy a bunch of gas, then the wind would change direction and it would all come back onto their own lines and kill all their own soldiers or wound them, so it was a very unpredictable weapon. Now, it was chlorine gas, I said, was the first gas that they, aside from tear gas, that was the first harmful gas that they deployed. As the war progressed, they started using deadlier and deadlier, or just progressing down the line of more effective gases to use. The next one they went to was phosgene gas, which phosgene gas it's generally considered to be the most deadly and most effective of the poison gases. That one was it was first deployed by, I believe, the British, and it was different from chlorine gas because the symptoms of phosgene gas weren't actually apparent. Most of the symptoms weren't apparent from when it first came into contact with troops. It actually was up to 24 hours it could take for the symptoms to start appearing, which it has both sides to it. One thing is that if you're attacking an enemy trench with phosgene gas, then the defenders, even if they're exposed to it, they won't really feel like they won't feel any symptoms. They'll still be fine to fight at that moment. So you're still going to be assaulting an enemy that's putting up a lot of resistance. But on the other side, generals might not know that the soldiers have been exposed to phosgene. So the next day they could send a bunch of troops on a mission, and then all of a sudden they just all start dropping dead or dropping on the ground, which could screw up plans. And they also started developing gas masks to counter gas, and it worked against chlorine gas and it worked against phosgene gas. But the next gas they went to was mustard gas, and mustard gas is kind of the poster child for the most deadly gas, or the most horrible, I should say, gas of the Great War. But it was not the most deadly. Most deadly was phosgene. Mustard gas was, the thing about mustard gas was the symptoms started as soon as a soldier came into contact with it. You get all these disgusting lesions all over your body, and the symptoms, I don't want to show a picture because it's so horrible, but it actually didn't kill as many soldiers as phosgene gas, but the symptoms were much more horrible. And actually, in general, gas was a very terrible and horrible weapon, but it actually I believe only around 10% of all soldiers who were exposed to poison gas were actually died within a few years of, or sorry, a few months of coming into contact. Although more casualties did take place later on as long-term symptoms that resulted, or long-term illnesses that resulted from the exposure to gases. But it wasn't the biggest killer of the war. That honor again goes to artillery. Now this is just a big cloud of gas that's been deployed. I'm not sure. The source didn't specify what battle this was at, but I believe this was the third battle of Ypres, not the second battle. But yeah, there were a bunch of major battles around the city of Ypres, and poison gas was first used at the second battle. Now, one of the other weapons that this is the end of my presentation, but I wanted to touch on one more thing: mines. So in World War I, one thing they would often do is they were trying to find ways to break the stalemate of trench warfare was the use of mines. And one thing was they would dig underground and all the way under no man's land and beneath the enemy trench, and try to put a bunch of explosives under there and then detonate it so that the enemy trench would just blow up. And they notably did this on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. The British detonated 13 or 14 mines against the German trenches to try to help their assaults to move forward. Yeah, but all in all, those are the primary ground-based weapons of World War I. I wish I could have talked about planes and warships and submarines, but there's simply so much to cover, and I really implore some of you to go out and Google some of this stuff, because it's very interesting. Humanity has created some very, very, very amazing and very interesting, very awesome weapons of war, but also very terrible. World War I was really, as Harry said, World War I was really the first technology war where the great powers were just trying to develop more and more advanced, more terrible weapons for the purpose of killing the enemy and winning the war. So, yep, that covers everything. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. How many German tanks were used in World War I?
Does anyone want to take a guess?
100.
100? Less than that?
50,
50? Less than that?
25,
Less than, or more than 10?
15,
37.
20.
And
Some
the
sources
French
say
and
21.
the British had about thousands each, right?
Mhm.
That's fantastic. Because
Only
the Germans
20.
had most of the machine guns.
Why was
just
there
want to
such
tell
a
them they did an
imbalance?
awesome job.
The Germans didn't, the British actually did a good job of, when they were developing their tanks, they did a good job of keeping it secret. Like, that's actually the reason why they called them tanks, was because they used the word tank as, like, in the sense of a water tank, because they wanted them to think it was some sort of, like, a product for or like agricultural or industrial product rather than a weapon of war. So the Germans, and they did a good job in general just concealing that. So by the time tanks came out, the Germans were caught extremely unaware, and it took them. A tank is a very complicated thing to manufacture, so it took them about 2 years to come up with their own design, which was the A7V. But that's basically why there was such a large disparity between the two. And one other thing was the Germans actually did utilize a lot of captured British and French tanks. They actually used hundreds, even thousands, or I believe even over 1,000 captured French and British tanks in their own army. They figured out how to operate them and repair them, etc. So.
Okay, well, thank you very much. A few things I'd like to touch on. That, first of all, I learned an awful lot.
He did an awesome job.
Didn't he do an awesome job?
Thank you.
If you look at the New York Times just a couple of days ago, they had a picture of a crater that still exists today from the Battle of the Somme. It was significant, and it's lasted 100 years.
Is that from a mine?
From the mine, yes.
So like Petersburg?
Well, just like at Petersburg, yes, which was in the Civil War, yes. Interesting thing, some people know it, but in World War II, the Germans did not use gas or chemical weapons. And the conjecture is it's because Adolf Hitler himself was gassed, and he suffered some of the consequences. He obviously survived. So he vowed not to use gas during the war, some people say, so he used V2s and V1s and other terrorist weapons. Here's an interesting thing. If you get a chance, later we have some time, to go over to the Radio Museum, and you'll see a lot of World War I radio artifacts. And it turns out that the Army Signal Corps, when they went over there to France, made significant developments. George Armstrong, Edwin Armstrong, sorry. Edwin Armstrong was a Signal Corps captain and later major. He's a brilliant man. He invented very significant circuitry that's still used today in every receiver and transmitter situation. He also invented frequency modulation, FM radios, which the U.S. Army used in World War II, the only army that used FM. But one of the significant developments the U.S. Signal Corps was working on, and the achievements they made while they were working there, was in tank communications, and communications for vehicles associated with tanks. And the Germans in the Blitzkrieg, one of the reasons they were so successful versus the French, who, as you know, made wonderful tanks, and the British, was that the Germans had communications in their tanks. The British and the French in World War II still did not. Okay, they still did not. They didn't work in that area, and that was another significant development. The Germans were also very, very sophisticated in their developments of large caliber or very large siege guns. And if you go to the World War II miniatures room, where Cole is a docent and Bob Paracelli has a display, he's got a scale model of what's called Anzio Annie, which is mounted, it's really cool, on a railroad car. It's a scale model, of course, but was used during the Battle of Anzio, and it was just an extension of the technology that the Germans had developed in World War I. And even though they were supposed to dissipate all their armor and their weapons and their cannons, they maintained the expertise. I just wanted to also mention that if you go to Europe, the American troops made their sacrifice there, and Dick, you can confirm that there's a cemetery in the Meuse-Argonne area. Right. There are
American Battle Monuments Commission has a number of cemeteries over there for World War I and World War II.
Right.
And if you write to them or call them, they'll send you booklets on every cemetery. They did a great job. American Battle Monuments Commission, Arlington, Virginia.
Thank you very much. There are 14,237 Americans buried in the Meuse-Argonne Cemetery. Okay. All of those casualties occurred 47 days before the armistice was signed. Significant number of casualties made the sacrifice towards the end of the war. But the Americans, as you heard before from Harry especially, were definitely the difference here. And just like in World War II, the Germans ran out of Germans in World War I, despite, again, settling things on the Eastern Front and moving personnel to the Western Front, trying to beat the Americans, you know, by Operation Michael before the Americans got into the war. So despite what you might hear from British historians, Pershing was right. And the Americans made the sacrifice, but that was the difference at the end of the war. And I'm glad you all came today. There's more to see, and thank you for your attention. We will have maps, there's things close by. I recommend